Hello everyone and happy Lunar New Year this time. This here is Bop. We are fostering him for a week to see if we're going to keep him. He is a rescue dog. He's only got 3 legs, but he gets around just fine. He's really timid, really shy. He's getting to know. He's only been here for a full day so far. We're trying to see if our other dogs get along with him and he gets along with them, and then we'll see if we'll keep him after a week. But just want to introduce him. He's such a cutie. I hope it works out. And today I'm going to talk about my 5 most fascinating assignments that I've ever done as a photojournalist. I'm going to show you some pictures and give you some tips along the way. It's going to be a fun episode. I'm going to talk about going undercover and getting pictures of the wildlife mafia here in Vietnam. I'm going to talk about a lot of cool things. So there are 5 stories. I'm only going to give you one now. I'll give you the rest later. So anyway, let's get into it. Let's talk photography. Alright guys, as always, don't forget to check out my online store at justinmott.com, where I've got presets like this one that will not make you a better photographer, but they will add some pop to your images. I've also got one-on-one classes open to all levels and all genres of photographers. And I've got a couple slots left for my Northern Vietnam photography workshop focused on street photography and travel photography. It's going to take place in March. Check that out right now. I've got a few slots left, so you can book it right now. If you're watching this, come join me. It's going to be an epic trip, and don't worry about your skill level. This is open to all levels. We're going to have a lot of one-on-one time, a lot of great tips in there, and just an overall fantastic experience. And if you're new here, guys, my channel is dedicated to all things photography from the perspective of a full-time working professional photographer. Me, give you my insight, talk about gear, give you tips along the way, show you my experience as a photographer, all sorts of cool stuff like that. And that leads me to today's episode. We're going to talk about my top 5 most fascinating assignments that I've been on. I've worked a career as a photojournalist for over a decade here in Southeast Asia. I've shot over 100 assignments for the New York Times and also shot for various other prestigious publications and magazines around the world. And today I'm going to talk about 5 of my most fascinating ones. I don't even know if they're my most fascinating. I have other ones too, but these are the first 5 that came to my mind. So to lead off with number 1, I'm going to talk about my first ever undercover assignment. This was a story I did for Time magazine, and then it led to doing a follow-up story for the United Nations. This was a story actually that got me sort of interested in the wildlife trade and interested in wildlife protection, wildlife conservation, and led to me having tattoos like this one of Fatu and Najin, the last 2 northern white rhinos left in the world. And I've got another tattoo here on my shoulder. So the assignment was from Time magazine, which is still prestigious, but it was pretty prestigious at the time. It was one of my first assignments for them. I think I had done another story about helmet safety in Vietnam, but this was kind of like right up my alley, something I was really interested in, but I was going to have to go undercover. So the story was about the illegal rhino horn trade around the world, and they had already done the poaching part in Africa, and they wanted to do the consumption side here in Vietnam. So that was going to require me to go undercover to pretend to be a potential buyer of rhino horn. In addition to that, I was going to have to be able to get access to photograph people consuming it and then photograph the illegal dealers as well. So what happened on this story was, it was a little bit nerve-wracking at the time, because it's still a nerve-wracking story for anyone to do, because these people that are involved in this kind of stuff are criminals, and they have connections, and they have power, and again, they're criminals. So, if they found out what I was doing and exposed me, they could hurt me, or worse, So I found a good fixer who had worked on this story before. She found some great access to a couple of people who are the consumers, who are willing to let me photograph them without showing their face. One lady in particular had terminal cancer, and she was consuming it because she thought it might cure her cancer, which isn't the case. And it's unfortunate that people put out this propaganda, and usually comes from the people that are trying to sell it and people involved in this business, the criminals like I talked about. So that was one part of the story, but my editor also wanted me to get the actual horn being dealt. So I went into the streets of Hanoi, and I found, this was a long time ago and things have cleaned up a little bit, but it's still a big problem. But I went into the streets, into traditional medicine street. Hanoi especially has these dedicated streets to different things, people selling different things. And it was interesting because even at the time, they're a little skeptical. I asked about it, said I might be interested in buying it for my grandmother back at home. And they kind of sent a kid, it was straight out of a movie. They sent a kid down the alleyway, comes back in a little burlap sack and showed it to me, but they wouldn't let me photograph it. Then I went to another shop and they told me they sold it, but they wouldn't show me it, and I just got a couple pictures there. Then I went to a actual government hospital, and the guy there showed me, and I just kind of slowly took out my camera and took a couple shots, and he seemed to be okay with it. He wanted to show me how much money he made off of it. He showed me the houses he bought with it. And then the real scary part was going to like an actual like Mafia guy. Went into his house and we had access through the fixer, and she told him like he was, we're playing off of his greed. He thought I could sell it for probably double the price to this stupid American. And he, gave me a sample. I had to drink it. It was uncomfortable to have to do that. And ethically, it was uncomfortable to do that, but I really felt the good outweighed the bad in that situation. But yeah, I mean, that was probably the more difficult. That was definitely one of the scariest assignments I've been on. Like, I was drunk. It was late, a little bit later in the afternoon, but he was still drunk. Went into his house like this lair. Like in the front, it looked like a normal like restaurant, but in the back, you go in, there was like a jar with giant rhino penis in it, elephant tusks all over the place, and you go out to his like living room area, and it was like kind of like a wooden carved table and scales on there and cash, and there was other people buying stuff and taking photos with their cell phones. And after I tried a sample of it, I asked him if he could take a photo with my camera of me and my fixture, and he did that. And then that kind of put the camera out there and made him comfortable with it. And at the time, it was actually like one of the first digital SLRs. This is how long ago it was that actually shot video, so I took video of him as well. But yeah, we filmed him, took photos. Hard to get like the composition and kind of the angles that I wanted. I had to kind of take what I could get there, but that was one of the more impactful assignments I've ever done, one of the more dangerous assignments I've ever done, and then afterwards quite dangerous too, because the whole thing where the photos accidentally got released and my name was attached to them, so then we were worried that like the Mafia guy was going to find out, and that was going to be an ordeal, but so we were kind of on edge for a couple months after that, because my address is on my website, and I live in Vietnam. So that's one of the more fascinating assignments for a lot of different reasons, because of the impact, because of how dangerous it was, but also how it sort of led me to a different part of my career later on, doing wildlife photojournalism and getting more involved in those kind of stories. The next story I'm going to talk about, this one was a more challenging assignment for me on a lot of different levels, but this was for the New York Times. This was a story on the garment industry in Bangladesh. This was after there was a bunch of fires. A lot of people died. A lot of these garment factories, so talking about the conditions of these factories. There was protests that came out, like violent protests. And Bangladesh, the economy is built on the garment industry, so very challenging to get in there. I was in Malaysia teaching a workshop with the U.S. Embassy. At the time I got the assignment, it was a brand new editor for the New York Times. And since then he's been fired, or he left, but it felt like he got fired. But he was like, and it came out that he was like really demanding a lot. There's a whole article about this guy and how a lot of people felt like he was like overly demanding. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say he was overly demanding to me, but it was definitely not fun to work for, I mean, if that's a good way to put it. But the assignment was to go into Bangladesh and find this guy that the police were looking for. He was like in charge of like the labor union. He had spoke out in protests and led protests against the garment industry people there, against the government there. And so the police were looking for him, and it was like, oh great, so I have to go to a country I've never been to and find a guy that the police are looking for, and I'm supposed to find him? But the crazy thing about the story was I was supposed to meet with the bureau chief for the New York Times at the time and meet him there. That was the information I had received. And then, to get a visa for an American in Malaysia, even though I live in Vietnam and I'm from America, it was quite complicated. Worked all that out. Got my visa, and when I got there, I was supposed to meet the bureau chief, and then he had arranged all these things already, so he had contact with this guy. And it turns out the bureau chief had actually already gone there and already done the story, and that wasn't communicated to me by the photo editor. So it was pretty crappy of the photo editor to put me in that position. But fine, as a photojournalist, as a photographer, any job, you just got to kind of like adapt and overcome. So I found this out like 2 days before I was supposed to go there, and so I had to adapt. And he's like, well, my fixture that I used isn't available, but there's a junior guy at his, because he was a guy that works in a newspaper there, but he's a junior reporter there, could maybe help you out. So I got his contact, and I had to find a way in. I had a friend who lived in Bangladesh, so I kind of pretended I was visiting him. Got the paperwork done by saying I'd be like staying with him, and he was legally living there, so a fellow American and a fellow photographer too. So I used that to get in. It was funny, at the airport, as I got in, I was really nervous going through immigration. And as I got there was a bunch of people from I think they were BBC, but they had a bunch of big cameras, like obvious Pelican cases, and obviously taking big cameras, and they got pulled aside and questioned. I don't know whatever happened to those guys. I went in very light, very minimalistic kit. And yeah, it was crazy. So I got into my hotel, met with my fixer, and this guy had never done fixing before, ever. And so it was like really, really green. Had to teach him, had to find this guy we're looking for, found him, take photographs of him, portraits of him in this tiny village that he was hiding out in with his family. Had to try to tell the story about the garment industry by traveling around the countryside, going to some of the areas, not sticking out, but it was really hard because like anywhere in Bangladesh, as a foreigner, as a white guy, you're going to stick out. But in the countryside, in some of these like garment provinces, it's like really obvious what I'm there to do. So I had to shoot a little bit from my car at the time and then get into the factory. I had to pretend I was a tourist. And I'll never forget like going to one factory, the guy was, he's like, well, why do you want to take pictures in here? And everyone knows, I mean, this is all over the news. So he's like, why do you want to take pictures? Like, well, I'm doing the story about different countries and what they're famous for and what they produce. And, you know, in Vietnam, I did a lot about rice production and coffee production, things like that. And it's like, all right, kind of bought it. And I felt really bad because he was really friendly to me, showed me around, took a lot of pictures of it wasn't that factory that was necessarily doing anything wrong, but I just wanted to get a sense of the garment industry there, what it looks like, the people that work there, the villages they live in, and that kind of stuff. So, you know, later on he had contacted me about like, oh, can I have some of the photos? And I just never got back to him. So it was like kind of undercover there as well. That was probably my second undercover kind of assignment, like ish. Challenging there for maybe less than a week or about a week. Again, working with a new fixer, working with someone I'd never done this before. I mean, he was so obvious. Like the first factory we went into, I was pretending to be just a like travel photographer, and he's taking notes and asking questions. I was like, no, ask questions and write it down later. Don't be taking notes in front of him. It's going to be obvious what we're doing. So I kept having to teach the guy. He was a really nice guy, but he was really young. He was really green. But we ended up getting a lot of the photos I needed to tell the story. In the end, the editor actually was like, it was a pretty cocky move. The photo editor was like, you know, because he kind of messed up. He did mess up by like, you know, not giving me the right information. And then I just kind of went there and got it done. And he was the new editor, and he wasn't that great to me in the beginning. And he was like, oh, I was really impressed by the fact that you did all that. He's like, I never call people, but I'm calling you. I think that's kind of like a douche thing to say. Like, I never call people, I'm calling you. Just thank me. That was it. But it's the kind of guy that never thanked you in emails, never appreciated. Like, you know, sometimes you do risk your life, or you risk your safety, things like that. Like other stories I had done, like shooting multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis and getting up close to it for that day rate of $250 a day. I don't know why I was doing that kind of stuff, but that's the life of a young photojournalist, I guess. And you know, there's people that do a lot worse stuff and go into war zones and stuff like that. So I'm not saying I'm at the extreme end of that stuff, but even just that, like maybe a thank you, maybe cool, like the photos if you ran it on the front page, or just something. You know, I don't need like a party. But anyway, and I did get a huge spread out of that, and I did get a lot of work after that. But anyway, that was a fascinating story for me to do, just because of how it played in the U.S., with a lot of garments that are purchased in the U.S. being made there, all the troubles that were associated with that, and having to go undercover to get that story, to tell that story, and you know, and do it when people like really, like, it was a hot time to be there and no one wanted me there. And we got by unscathed. A couple close calls, but got away unscathed, so that was good. The next story is a little bit lighter, and this one was a lot of fun. This was one of those like true adventures. When you think about being a photographer, you're like, oh, this is the kind of story you think you romanticize about doing all the time. I don't know if you're naive enough, you think you're gonna always do these kind of stories, but this was an assignment for the Smithsonian. I love their assignment. Every time I get an email from the Smithsonian, I'm excited, and I know I'm going on a fun adventure. And I know it's going to be a unique story. So this was about the oldest original cave art found in the world. So there was these hand stencils that were uncovered in like a very remote part of Indonesia. I didn't dig up all the information about the times, but I'll put a link to these stories so you can see them. But it was fascinating. So there's a couple Australian archaeologists and then the Indonesian team that were there, and they made this huge discovery. And so it was like they found these like, you know, hand like tracings in these old caves. Like we're talking like, I'm gonna mess this up, but a very long time ago. And you can see why I'm not a writer. I'm a good photographer, because I just get like the general idea of the story, and then my brain 100% focuses on like, where do these photos fit into place and how do I tell the story with the photos, rather than like think too deeply about the facts and all that kind of stuff. And then I move on to the next story. But anyway, the story was fascinating. I had to go to this very remote place, so flying to Jakarta, and then take another flight to like a tiny little place, and then take from there like a ridiculously long car ride. All had to be arranged ahead of time. I didn't really know much going into it, didn't have a contact there on the ground. There was a writer that was already going there, and she was going to be leaving by the time I got there, just the way the timing works. I think at the time I was also filming my TV show, so I was really like doing back-to-back shoots, and then filming my show in between, then running my commercial photography business, so kind of an insane time for me. But, you know, to go there, to go to this remote place, just to get there was an adventure. And then when I got there, I arrived in the middle of the night, and there was nowhere for me to sleep. It was just like a hardwood floor on like a building that was outside, mosquitoes, hot, sweaty, like gross. Like It was tough. I was just getting eaten alive. No one told me to bring a mosquito net. I probably should have known better. But I didn't do any of the logistics. Like, they handled it all, and no one told me to bring a sleeping bag. I thought they would, it's an archaeological dig, so I should have maybe known that it wasn't set up for like someone to be there and like stay there and sleep there without having their own stuff. But I never assumed, so that was a mistake by me. But I made do, had a horrible night's sleep, found some like crappy coffee in the morning, met the archaeologist, and then just the next few days, it was funny because the writer was just like basically just leaving. She had been kind of ripped off by the translator driver and everything. She's like, I spent so much money here. I'm like, yeah, that's Indonesia. You better know what you're doing. So I cleaned up right away. I'm like, I didn't need like a full-on driver and then another translator and then pay another guy to follow us around all day. I basically just had a driver and a translator, and I worked out a rate that was better than hers and saved myself a lot of money. I felt bad for her because I was getting reimbursed, but she had done it for like a flat rate. That was kind of interesting for those of you that aren't in the world. Like, some writers will do it for like a flat rate, a story, and then a lot of photographers, we won't do that. We'll do it off of like a day rate plus our expenses. And so it's going to be there for several days because it's such a long trip. And yeah, I mean, it was fantastic. They showed me all these different spots they were working on. I got to see the original cave art. It was really hard to photograph cave art because they're in caves, and I didn't want to bring artificial lighting or too much artificial lighting because I didn't want to look too fake or staged, but I still wanted to see the details. So, I had my best low light camera, best low light lens, and tried to capture like a little bit of the camp, do some portraits of the two big archaeologists. There was like an Indonesian archaeologist that he, honestly, like, it didn't seem like he was doing a lot, but he dressed the part. He had like the whole Indiana Jones look, maybe minus the whip. But they kept telling me like, you have to photograph him too, because we can't do this without them. So I did that. It became a huge story afterwards, and still is a big discovery in that world especially. And that's another thing for photographers to like remember, is you just never know. Like, give your best effort in every single shoot, because those images, those portraits I took of those guys, those still sell like years later. And actually a couple of the guys bought like a set of portraits because they get so sick of like having to ask me every time. So I just basically sold them for them to use to promote themselves. But I made a lot more money afterwards from that story compared to what I made. And I still made a decent amount during that story because the Smithsonian actually pays pretty well, a lot better than New York Times. But got a big spread. Editor was happy with it. I was very happy with it. It was a fun shoot. The guys were fantastic. A couple mistakes I made there that you shouldn't make is nothing technically, photographically. I think I did a great job. The low light stuff, again, I had planned to do it that way. I didn't want to use flash. Trying to tell the story inside and outside of the caves and their camp and the portraits of the guys. But a mistake I made was like, I didn't bring these guys anything. I should have brought, you should never show up empty-handed. I said that in another episode. And I didn't realize like how remote this place was, again, because I was so engulfed in all my other stories and all my other assignments that I have a ton of time to research and do the logistics. Like, I knew what the story's about. I knew what I was getting into once I got there because I did all my homework on the plane and again beforehand as well. But I should have brought them a bottle of whiskey because like the archaeologist was like, every night he poured me some and he's like, hey, you know how hard for it is to get this stuff? I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. Like, I should have brought a couple bottles of whiskey, and I drank the stuff they gave me because it were long days and sweaty days. It was hot days and tiring days. So I shouldn't have drank so much that he gave me, and I should have brought some for him as well. So that was a little lesson there. But that was such a fun adventure. I look back on that story, and like, again, anytime a Smithsonian editor emails me, I'm excited for the shoot. This ended up being quite long, so I think I'm just going to leave it at 3 today, and I'll do 3 more for a follow-up episode and make this a little two-parter. I hope that works for you guys. Again, guys, hope you enjoyed this. This was just a way for me to like show you some of my fun assignments, show what it's like to be a photojournalist and get out there and go on some fun adventures, share some pictures with you, share some tips along the way, let you into my world a little bit. Hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, I'll be more motivated to do part 2, but I think I'll do part 2 anyways, no matter how this does. Again, guys, don't forget to check out my online store at justinmott.com. Don't forget to sign up for my workshop. A few slots left. Maybe by the time you watch this, there won't be left. I don't know. I hope not. Or I hope so. I mean, I'd like you guys to join me. Thanks for bearing with me on a little intro with my dog, my new dog here, Bop. And hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Let me know in the comments section if you have any questions. Let me know what you thought of this episode in the comments section. Appreciate that, guys. Again, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And for those of you that have already subscribed, if you want to go further, if you want a relationship to get deeper, you could join as a member. You get exclusive content, early releases. You get priority in the comments section. You get bonus content, all sorts of cool stuff like that. Again, you can do that by hitting the join button below this video, and it costs $4.99 a month. Guys, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and don't forget to have a wonderful day.